Will the Ole Miss Rebels get some revenge against the Florida Gators after last year's loss in the swamp? We're also going to be talking about some possible big news in terms of the betting lines and which players for Ole Miss could be all SEC. That is today on this crossover, Locked On Rebels and Locked On the Portal.
Locked On presents The Portal, the daily podcast covering college football recruiting and everything NIL. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Welcome back into another edition of the Portal Podcast and a crossover with Locked On Ole Miss. I am your host, Brian Smith, longtime college football writer and recruiting analyst. Thank you for making the Portal Podcast or Locked On the Ole Miss your first listen each and every day. Truly appreciate you stopping in. Today's show is brought to you by Monarch Money. Take control of your finances with Monarch Money. Use code LOCKEDONCollege at monarchmoney.com for 50% off your first year. Ole Miss has a rather interesting situation coming up with the top players that they're going to be throwing out onto the field this year. Kiffin's roster is one of the best they've had in a long time, and a key for that is depth. Well, it just so happens that a team that Ole Miss lost to last year, the Florida Gators, come to Oxford on November 15th in a revenge game, a very important one, and Ole Miss's added depth should be very important. We're going to talk about that first, but we're also going to talk about some interesting stuff with Phil Steele, having some of the players for Ole Miss being possible all SEC performers, and there are some betting lines out on big SEC games involving the Ole Miss Rebels. Talking about all of that and more here on this crossover. And to help me divulge all that information, Stephen Willis, Locked On Ole Miss. What's going on, Stephen?
Not a whole lot. I did see that the betting lines came out and Phil Steele has some good stuff, but I think you want to talk about the Gators starting off, right?
Yes, I do. Yes, I do. That is a really hard game to pick, and that's one of the reasons I wanted to talk about it, because it's fascinating what Ole Miss is going to be seeing there. You got a really talented quarterback, but he's not been super healthy. He's going to be in his second year. If he is healthy, I mean, the kid's incredibly gifted. But how well will Florida's season gone to that point? Because if it's not gone well, how many are invested? That's why this is one of the hardest games to look at, because if they're at around 500 at this point, you could argue they're playing for Billy Napier to keep his job, but you could also be arguing that some of these guys are checked out. So it is one of the hardest teams to figure this year would be the Florida Gators. And I follow them pretty close because I run Locked On Seminoles, and obviously that's a rivalry game, and it's Florida. I mean, it's an interesting program. But besides DJ Ladway, I doubt all that many people are really going to know a whole lot of players for the Florida Gators, and that's fine. But what I also think is important is that you understand that they have not just improved their roster, but dramatically so, like talent-wise. They're still a little young. At wide receiver, they're starting to get some more talent in the trenches, especially on the offensive line. They've got Jake Slaughter back, who's maybe the best center in the Southeastern Conference. Always good to have a talented player like that as a graduate student at the pivot. And defensively, there's no more excuses, especially in their secondary, where they've just been a sieve, despite a ridiculous amount of recruiting talent that hasn't shown its wares consistently. Guys either banged up, like Devin Moore's their best corner. He'll be a senior this fall, but is he going to be ready? I don't know. You got Cormani McClain, a former five-star, Jordan Castell, another kid that was talked about as a possible five-star, like all these guys. So going against Lane Kiffin in particular, let's start on the defense. You got a lot of key players that are juniors, sophomores, a few fifth-year seniors on their defense. Do you think Kiffin's going to save a little something? Again, this game is November 15th, Stephen. I think it's a really important game on Ole Miss's schedule. And if they don't win, it could knock them out of the playoff chase. What do you think about the Gators this year?
I think it's good. I do not think Lane Kiffin is going to save anything for that game, because the LSU game at the end of September, the Georgia game, the South Carolina game, the Oklahoma game, they're all big games on Ole Miss's schedule leading into that. And I think Lane Kiffin will empty the tank. Now, one thing that's pretty interesting, Lane Kiffin struggled against Ron Roberts at now Baylor, at Auburn, and now at Florida. But this is the first time he's seen him with the same personnel lining up and playing them in back-to-back years. So it might be a situation to where Lane Kiffin adapts pretty well. If you look to what happened in 2020 when Matt Corral had the 6-interception game that was so famous, the next year they scored 54 points. If you look at other times that Lane Kiffin has struggled offensively, if they get the team the next year and you're not dealing with Georgia or Alabama, if it's like one of the other schools in the conference, Lane Kiffin usually finds a way to be pretty successful in that. And since Florida knocked Ole Miss out of the playoffs a year ago, I think they're going to be pretty jazzed up for that game and to want to perform pretty well. I know that Lane is not above starting a game plan on a team 12 months out and breaking that down. And Florida could very well be that this season.
Well, I mean, if you already named the schools, like some of those bigger SEC contests for the Rebels begin the season, you're probably not going to win all four of those. I think that's a pretty safe assumption. That's going to be, if they do, then it's a whole nother conversation. Every game becomes just cataclysmic because if you can obviously run the table, you're going to get a top 3 seed in the tournament and all that stuff. But if they're 2-2 in those four, this game is for playoff survival.
Yes.
And
that very well could happen. If you look at LSU at home and South Carolina at home, it could be a home game against the Florida Gators with losses at Georgia and at Oklahoma. I mean, that is the likely scenario if you want to look at chalk of what's going on, is lose the game to Georgia, lose the game to Oklahoma, beat LSU, beat South Carolina, and then a Florida game for all the marbles. And if that happens, I expect a fairly loose Ole Miss team. I expect this to be a huge game for Austin Simmons, regardless, just because he is from the state of Florida. And there are several players on Ole Miss's roster. If it is 2-2 to where Ole Miss needs to beat Florida and Mississippi State to finish 10-2 and make it to the playoffs, that being the last home game, that being senior night in Oxford, it'll be a night game likely. All of the consequences that come with a game like that, I like Ole Miss in that scenario.
that would be a very fun environment in Oxford, I'm sure. It would be pretty wild, needless to say. And it's not like there's any love lost for Florida anyway. So it will be a big game for Austin. He was committed to the Gators at one point. He's from South Florida. Obviously, that's going to mean something to him. What do you think is going to be most different about Ole Miss defensively this year that might give them a chance against Lagway? Is there anything that it's going to be all that much different, or is it just going to be go out and figure it out and we'll adjust as the year goes on?
Honestly think Ole Miss lost Princely Amon Mielen, which that was a big game, maybe for a detriment against Florida a year ago, if we're going to be honest and look at the way it ended. But Sontaran Perkins is going to be the alpha on that defensive unit. There's players like Andrew Jones. There's players like Jaden Yates. There's really athletic guys to the point where Ole Miss's defense might actually be more athletic as a total unit than they were a year ago. Now, Walter Nolan and those guys was completely freaks. But athletically speaking, this could be a more athletic defense, and they need it because my favorite player on that Florida team is not DJ Lagway. It's the running back that Jaden's his first name.
Jaden Ball. Yeah.
He's
a downhill after contact guy that is annoying. Yeah.
He's fantastic.
Yeah. That's a kid they got out of the Houston area, and he was recruited pretty heavily, but not as high as some other guys in Florida. I'll give him credit. That staff just prioritized him. They liked his film. Obviously it's worked out. I mean, he was their best running back as a freshman. I mean, and they have other guys that were good. Don't get me wrong, but he just kind of won just learned the offense and went out and made plays. That is not normal in the Southeastern Conference for a freshman to be that guy, but he's got some size to him. And if Ole Miss has any hopes of beating some of those other teams, Georgia in particular, it's going to be important that they're able to take on some bigger running backs and some guys that are really athletic. Ball, I'm not sure what he's up to now because, you can look at depth charts and all that stuff and see different sizes. But I want to say he was like 210, 215 last year. The one depth chart I'm looking at right now says 230. That's a really big kid.
You,
Um,
you,
I
you're
don't
getting to
know.
the point where you're starting to worry about speed and quickness once you hit 230, in my opinion. We're not dealing with Stephen Davis from Auburn from back in the day. So we'll
Yeah,
have
he
to
was
see what
hit here.
happens. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a really good football player. But Ole
Mhm.
Miss, I mean, we're going to talk about a couple of these guys here in a second. The linebacker room at Ole Miss got some serious talent, and they're going to be challenged. But it's still the
Mhm.
defensive line that sets all that up. And they finally, we've talked about this many times on the show, Stephen. They have finally recruited in the trenches well enough out of the high school ranks where they don't just have to just bombard the portal to be good. Bieber and some of those other guys, they've got, you know, Cameron and all those guys. They have enough talent, but now are they going to be ready, especially late in the year after you've went through all these different battles to take? I mean, Ford is straightforward. We're going to try to run the ball. Can you stop us? And then we're going to throw play action. It is a very old school, almost like early 90s Dallas Cowboys offense. So that should be a rather interesting matchup. When we come back, we're going to talk about some of the players that Phil Steele believes have not just a chance, but like these guys are going to be all SEC level players. That is next here on this crossover of Locked on Ole Miss and Locked on the Board. Ever wish managing your money was a little bit easier? With Monarch Money, it can be. Whether you're growing your savings or planning a big purchase, Monarch puts you in the driver's seat. It's like having your own personal CFO, giving you full visibility and control over your finances. Monarch Money is more than a budgeting app, it's a complete financial command center. You can track all your accounts, investments, and spending in one place. So, in addition to managing your money, you also have the opportunity to actually build wealth. To that end, whatever it is you're trying to save for retirement, you can find little ways to save more money to put back for whatever it may be: a car, paying off the house earlier. Maybe it is a college fund for your grandkids, whatever it may be. Monarch Money can help you achieve that goal. Take control of your finances with Monarch Money. Use code Locked On College at monarchmoney.com for 50% off your first year. That's monarchmoney.com, code Locked On College for half off your first year. All right, Stephen, after some technical difficulties here, what do you think is the most likely player beyond Sunterian Perkins to end up being all SEC? This topic, I mean, Perkins is the low hanging fruit, obviously, but besides him.
Yeah, probably Deshaun Stribling, the wide receiver, or maybe one of the tight ends, either Daquan Wright or Luke Haas. One of those guys will likely in there. Perhaps one tight end, one and the wide receiver both make it. It all depends on the type of year that Austin Simmons has. I like really what Deshaun Stribling brings to the table as a receiver. He does some of the things that made Trey Harris so effective. Now, he's not Trey Harris, but he is athletic enough to kind of compensate from that. And the wide receiver room, when you take Deshaun Stribling and Caden Lee, because Caden Lee could have 90, 100 catches and end up on this list as well. But whenever they're on the same field and they work in tandem, I think there's a pretty good chance that you're going to be able to get one every single time, if that makes sense.
Yeah, there's going to be a matchup problem against Ole Miss again this year. Whenever they play teams, you're going to have to make decisions on each down and distance. Hey, which guy do we want to take away? And now that a lot of these guys, like Caden Lee is one of my favorite players in the SEC. It's a kid I know from high school, played in the Atlanta area, really, really athletic and just a great route runner. Okay, how do you take away a slot receiver, though? That's hard because they go in motion a lot. They use them in screens. They don't line up on the line of scrimmage, etc. And he can also line up outside. So little things like that make it difficult. And on this list that Phil Steele has, these are the players that he mentioned. Sunterian Perkins, not shocking. Second team, which I think is too low. I think he should be a first team pick by everybody. That's just my opinion. He's got Lee third team. He's got Daquan Wright third team. He's got TJ Daugherty fourth team. And then the kicker that came in, I'm not sure if I'm going to pronounce this right, but Lucas Canero, third team. Now, those are all really good players. And you mentioned like maybe Haas is a guy that ends up getting more. That stuff will play itself out. But I'm going to go ahead and throw this out there. And I know he hasn't been a starter yet, but I think that the signal caller for the Ole Miss Rebels should at least be in the conversation. It's the SEC. I know there can only be a few guys on each team, blah, blah, blah. But if he ends up in the conversation going into like the Florida game in the middle of November as a possible all SEC guy, I will not be surprised. This is not your normal teenager. He's the kind of kid that goes to wall school and graduates early. So he can process differently. I like Austin Simmons a lot.
Yeah, and if Ole Miss makes it to the playoffs this year, it gets to the point where they get in, finally kick that door down to get into the tournament, Austin Simmons absolutely belongs on one of those teams because Ole Miss is not in that position without him.
Yeah, because the decision-making to just get them in the right play or get them out of the wrong play is going to be as important as it can possibly be. I don't know if Ole Miss will be the best offense in the SEC. I don't know which team it will be. I'm sure LSU will be in that conversation. But Ole Miss, I think, conservatively, will be one of the top 5. Now, you can pick however you want to go with that. I really don't know. Like, it's really hard to predict. But Alabama, Ole Miss, and LSU would probably be the 3 I would pick. And I'm sure you could go with some others, and people at Texas would probably yell about that, but I need to see the health of a few guys there. They would be right there too. But all those teams, but how many guys do you really think are like Austin Simmons? So I want to give him a little love. He's not on this list, but the guy that I wasn't as familiar with that I wanted to ask you about, Stephen, is TJ Daugherty.
Okay.
This CFB Stats, this is what they had him with last year. By the way, CFB Stats is a great site if you want any information on any school, Ole Miss or otherwise. 76 tackles, 4.5 tackles for loss, 2 sacks, a pass breakup, 4 quarterback hurries, and a forced fumble. Last year was the first time he started out at Clemson, that he came to Ole Miss, didn't really play much his second year of college football, but then last year exploded. What do you think his best attribute is? And he's the guy that's going to be making the play calls for the Rebs on defense too. What do you think his best attribute is?
We did that a year ago as well. I think the best attribute for him is the getting all the talented players lined up. Everybody likes to talk about Chris Paul and the year that he had at linebacker, getting an All-American type season. Well, a lot of that was due to TJ Daugherty making sure everything was in the right location. He is somebody that has the green dot on the back of his helmet. He talks directly with Pete Golding on the calls of the defense, but he also has the athleticism of a 4'6" guy. He plays the linebacker position with reckless abandon. He's a typical Clemson type recruit out of the state of Alabama when he came out of high school. He can really go, but he also obviously has the ability to retain and everything if Pete Golding immediately trusted him with the green dot on the back of the helmet.
That's an impressive player. Daquan Wright, I know a little bit about, but do you like him better as a blocker or a receiver, and why?
I think he's a receiver. He beat out essentially Caden Prieskorn last season. And at the end of the year, he was starting at tight end. He had a touchdown catch, played really well against Duke in the Gator Bowl. He is somebody that Austin Simmons can be used as a weapon as he learns the position. Caden Lee, we know Kim and Caden Lee are going to have a connection. Those two are roommates. They have that connection. I think Daquan Wright has a chance to be the other part of the middle of the field that makes Austin Simmons really successful.
All right. And then lastly, Caden Lee, I already said this on your show. I'm going to say it again right now. I expect him to lead the Southeastern Conference in receptions, not yards, but total number of catches. Do you think that he will be far and away Ole Miss's number 1 receiver, or you think it'll be pretty balanced, and maybe you even think somebody else will lead them in receptions?
Listen, over the last 5 years, there's always been that one guy, that number 1 option for Lane Kiffin. And it makes sense that it would be Caden Lee because he has 2 years in the system. He's roommates with Austin Simmons, all of that. But there's so much talent in this wide receiver unit to where I think there's toys available for Lane Kiffin. When you look at the fact that freshmen like Caleb Cunningham and Winston Watkins are not even being talked about as somebody that can come into Ole Miss and contribute early, that lets you know how deep they are with Harrison Wallace III and Deshaun Stribling on the outside. And on the inside, you have Winnie Watkins and you have Caden Lee. This wide receiver unit has a chance to be pretty special. Now, my question for you is there a chance that Caden Lee, the athleticism, there a chance with his sure-handedness that he returns punts?
I mean, he'd be good at it. The question is more with Lane Kiffin and the staff. Everybody's got a different opinion on that, Stephen. Do you risk your star receiver getting banged up in special teams play? And that's just subjective. I don't know how you answer it. You tell me, do you think Kiffin would do – did he do it a lot in his career prior to this year?
I'm not sure. But the reason I ask is because on Thursday's show, I talked about the top 5 most important specialists, and a lot of the specialists is guesswork because nobody covers specialists. But Winnie Watkins returning punts, that feels like a natural fit to me.
He's got great hands, and he's always been that guy. He's always been a slot receiver. It's a kid I knew well. I'd be surprised if he doesn't do it at some point during his Ole Miss career, but I don't know if he'll do it as a freshman. Coaches don't like freshmen catching the punts very much. That's my experience. But physically, he has the tools to do it. He's got great hands.
Yeah, that's the reason I asked about Caden Lee being an upper class, very good hands.
It's possible.
Yeah.
If it's not him, I don't know who it would be, but you might save Caden Lee for games that are more important, like LSU or Florida. That's another way to look at it, because one play in one of those games can change the outcome without question. Those kinds of games. Yeah, I could absolutely see it. And speaking of the outcomes, when we come back, we're going to discuss a few point spreads that have been released on LSU and Georgia and Mississippi State. That is next here on this crossover Locked On Ole Miss and the Portal podcast. All right, Stephen, let's talk a little bit about the recent and these are going to change, I know, but the point spreads came out with Ole Miss having LSU, we got the Mississippi State game I'll get to last, the Georgia game on the road, and then Mississippi State. They're -1.5 with LSU coming to Oxford. That seemed, you and I are like, yeah, that's not really shocking. They're fairly similar teams. The home team gets the edge. Not really a big shock there. Georgia 9.5 on the road. I'd like your thoughts on that. And then 15.5 point spread in favor of Ole Miss, but on the road in Mississippi State. And I know they're not very good, but I thought it was kind of high. You thought it would be even higher, though. So we'll go through those three. Let's just do them in order. LSU first. That game is always good. LSU, at least in the last, say, 5 years. It's a good football game, and it's usually one of the more entertaining ball games each year. What do you think is going to be the most likely key element to who wins that game? Is it going to be turnovers, which is the easy answer, or is it going to be something else? What do you got for me on that?
I think obviously turnovers. If Nussmeier or Austin Simmons gets loose with the football, it could be problematic. These two teams are incredibly even. Anything that can switch momentum is going to be a big thing. I think you need to play that game straight up, personally. But I think offensive line play and the team that can establish the line of scrimmage, is going to be the team that probably takes that to the next level. These are two extremely evenly matched teams. LSU beat Ole Miss last year in overtime. The overtime catch was the only time they led in the entire ball game. I mean, Ole Miss doesn't win in Baton Rouge, but LSU doesn't win in Oxford right now, and it should be fun. That would be the heads up ABC at night game. I think that game has a chance to be an amazing atmosphere. Yeah,
I agree with that. And there's a lot of different ways you can look at that game. You'd think eventually one of them might pull away from the other, but the last few years, those games, it's a one possession kind of ball game with 4 minutes to go, and anything can happen. One penalty, one drop pass, one interception, whatever can seal the deal. So I think 1.5, and right now, again, it's favoring Ole Miss. That's fair. Mm-hmm. The one that I thought was maybe a little high, and I know it's at Georgia, 9.5 seemed high to me. I thought it'd be more like 5 to 7. somewhere in that range. But you know what? Georgia at home doesn't lose very often either. What are your thoughts on Georgia being favored by 9.5 over Ole Miss?
If you were to tell me at the beginning of this season there was one game that Ole Miss absolutely was not going to win, and it's going to be at Georgia, I would buy it. Kirby Smart and Georgia, they're going to be completely ready because they got beat down in Oxford. It was one of the few times that you've seen a Kirby Smart team just completely get physically dominated in a football game. And I get the feeling that Kirby Smart, the master motivator, is going to work the best out of his team in that game. I think that game is more like a 14-point game. I'm not surprised by that. I don't think it should be minus 14. I think the line's about where it needs to be, but I think that game is going to be about a 14-point game. It was one of those things where you look at it and you say, Georgia, lay the points. That's what I think is going to happen in that game. Just the motivation factor and everything that's going on. Get ready to get the Georgia Bulldogs best if you're an Ole Miss Rebel fan. And I don't know if Ole Miss is ready for that, if that makes sense.
The only thing I'll back up the other direction is I don't trust their quarterback situation.
That's true.
If he ends up being good, then it's good luck to everybody because Georgia out recruits everybody. But if quarterback's not being even remotely maximized, and I don't expect it will be, then those other players just don't have the ability to be on the field as long. Your defense is not rested as long. All those things, they just compound. So, like Georgia, just their passing game last year, I mean, they dropped passes and stuff and everything, but their biggest problems, they couldn't run the ball, Stephen. They averaged 125 yards a game on the ground. That should never be the case at the University of Georgia. Yeah. We'll see if they're better, but yeah.
Yeah. What would Gunnar Stockton look like coming into this year? What would the opinion of him be if the playoff never happened and just the second half versus Texas was there?
I don't know, because he was a gamer in the Texas game. I mean, you got to give him credit. He ran the ball pretty well. He's a gutsy kid. He had some nice throws. He actually started the Notre Dame game pretty good. He was like 6 for 6 or something like that. But then Notre Dame adjusted a little bit, and he fell off a cliff. So he's got a whole offseason now to work with those guys, though. I don't put a lot of stock in it, but some people might.
What happened in that Notre Dame game is Gunnar Stockton was going off a script. It was still scripted plays. So they had time to completely work on that stuff. So that could be the Gunnar Stockton that once he gets experience, that's what it looks like. That's all my point is.
Well, if he's good, then Georgia's a top 5 team.
Yeah.
That's how I look at it. If he's mediocre, that's a 3 or 4 loss team because you've got to be able to throw the ball in this league now. Even Georgia gives up points, and nobody really out-recruits them. So we'll see. Finally, Stephen, Mississippi is never going to be different on the day of the Egg Bowl. Everything kind of shuts down. Everybody watches that game, even though that Mississippi State shouldn't be very good this year. We know that this is the first year they kind of start their rebuild for real, but I just don't think they've added enough pieces yet. And in conjunction with having a new staff and all that's just hard. So I expect like best win scenario for them is maybe 5. Like if everything went right, they could win 5 games. It's possible. But I highly doubt that's going to be against Ole Miss. But still, 15.5 points in Starkville. Off the top of your head, do you remember a point spread like that in the Egg Bowl at any point in the last 10, 15 years?
I think they were favored by close to 20 a year ago. It was a big number a year ago. And
it was bad.
Yeah.
Bad.
But it's one of those things where even if it was 15.5 points, I would probably take Mississippi State in that game. Ole Miss is likely going to win, but it's not going to be a 15-point win. The game is never that, just the way it works. It's going to be a tight game. It's going to be a nail biter. 15.5 seems like a nice placeholder until we find out what's going on with the season. I will say this. I think that Tennessee is on upset alert when they play Mississippi State. I am convinced of that at this point. They are absolutely on upset alert. I do not think Ole Miss is.
I just know that the Egg Bowl is one of my favorite games of the year anyway, but I saw the 15.5. I thought it was a little high because it's in Starkville. And if it's in Oxford, it's just a different animal. But the cowbells and all that. By the way, that's the only stadium I have no interest in ever visiting because I don't want to hear cowbells all night. That's just,
The Wednesday of the next week, it sounds like bees flying around your head. And
yeah.
I will say this in that game, Ole Miss has won 4 out of 5 in Starkville.
Have they really? That's an impressive number. That's a tough place to play. It really is.
Yeah, the only time that they've lost in that series was the 2019 game that got Lane Kiffin to Ole Miss.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
The irony. Okay. Steven, tell everybody where they can find your work, my friend.
Yeah, check me out at the Locked On Ole Miss podcast on YouTube and wherever you get your podcast. You see my Twitter handle down below. You can follow that as well for some stuff. And we like to have a lot of perspectives about college football. We had Chris Beard on the show 2 weeks ago. We had Coach Yo on this week. Podcast is growing quite a bit. We're on a little bit of a heater right now.
All right. Well, I like to hear that, my friend. You can find the Portal Podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Locked On's got us going in the right direction on this side too. So I'm really enjoying it. Spotify, Apple, YouTube, and anywhere else you get your podcasts. We will see you again soon.